First, I want to start off with some true confessions from the Washington Consensus, which I will take that true confession as identifying the need for broadly based agricultural growth, actually a point very complementary to what we just heard. And then I would like to put forward a few immodest proposals of what perhaps we need to learn how to do. First, we need to take some risk on targeting and also understand the risk of those whom we target. Second, I think we really need to pursue testing the hypothesis that social protection can be productive. I think we need to be a little more aggressive in thinking about the impacts of cash transfers, but also asset transfers. And finally, we need, those of us who have traveled in the tube in London are very familiar with the expression, mind the gap. I think we need to mind the gap a little bit and think a little bit about the political economy of economies in which perhaps we don't succeed at these kinds of things. So let me try to say a little bit about both of these. So the lead point on this slide here was done mostly out of mischief to try to cause problems for the suffering people doing the translation. So I have true confessions from the WC. WC, of course, standing for Washington Consensus. The quote there, and I ask you to pay particular attention to the part in italics. This comes from John Williamson. Most of you know he's the individual who actually coined the term Washington Consensus. And he wrote a rather remarkable little piece in the IMF magazine, Finance and Development, in 2003. And basically, John is saying, you know, what have we learned in the 13 or so years since this Washington Consensus term was coined? And basically what he said is, we've learned there are some people in the economy for whom trade liberalization actually is not enough. People that don't have sufficient access to assets, don't have sufficient access to markets, and something else needs to be done. It's interesting if you go back and look at that piece, which I did last night as I was thinking about my comments. John actually there says, you know, we need to have countries in positions where macro policy can be counter-cyclical, something we talked about earlier. We need exchange regimes that can stabilize and be buffer. Again, something we talked about yesterday in very interesting detail. And he's saying, and yet even after we do those things, right, we need to attend to sort of making sure people have the basic asset position in order to be able to succeed with the opportunities that a liberalized economy presents. So I'm going to take John Williamson's comment as in a way offering us a kind of a summary of the narrative of what I think is underlying this conference. This conference has been very bold in bringing very macro issues and very micro issues together, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So what I hear John Williamson's revisionism, if you will, WC revisionism, saying is that one, we know that economic growth has heterogeneous impacts on poverty reduction if we look beyond the averages, to pinch a title of Martin Revallian papers, but I think Professor Rahan's discussion the last session made that quite clear. Secondly, so growth is just not enough, right? There are conditioning factors if we're interested in what happens at the bottom of the income distribution. There are reasons to privilege agricultural growth, at least in many kinds of economies, if we're interested in poverty reduction. Again, another point that's been made by several speakers. And finally, we need to think about broadening the base of agricultural growth, that is the direct participation of poor households. Now, I think we could debate all of these points, and I'm not going to do that, though. Instead, I'm going to sort of say, let's take that as being the brief or one perspective on what this conference is about. Then I would like to bring up just a few points then on what we need to do in order to broaden the base of agricultural growth. So the first thing is to take some risk on targeting. Now, I want to emphasize this in part because in my own country, the United States right now, the U.S. government is launching a major food security and hunger initiative. And very much the discussion is how can we reach further down the wealth spectrum. Now, I think one thing we've talked about here is can East Asia learn from Latin America? Well, especially in terms of integrating agriculture into modern supply chains. This is actually a problem for the smallholders in Latin America. And I want to just reference, as we think about this, I want to reference what I see to be some of the problematic political economy. So the diagram here actually comes from an impact evaluation I've been working on the Millennium Challenge Corporation's program in Nicaragua. This is a program that was set up to be inclusive of small farmers and to try to bring them into modern supply chains. Now, what happens, of course, as the program gets implemented, and in part because MCC takes evaluation very seriously, the people implementing the program don't want to reach too far down the income distribution, right? They don't want to go down to these people that are on $1 a day because they say they're too hard to reach. And so we actually brought that out. And this is a program that is explicitly anti-poverty in its orientation. And what this diagram is just showing is this is the rural income distribution for the part of Nicaragua where this program is being implemented. And what you see is the percent of poor people being included in the program, and that's what's represented by the solid line, is much, much lower. Okay, so there's been an implicit targeting that took place, not because anyone had the wrong intentions, but there's I think, a real need to think hard, and I think for people doing development programming, to experiment with how far down this way can you actually go when it comes to integrating small farmers into the supply chain. Again, I think in Latin America this has been highly problematic because there's a lot of people up here who have a lot of agricultural resources. So if you don't integrate these people, there's no general equilibrium problem. There's plenty of supply response out here. But if we're going to get more serious about having agricultural growth, which is also poverty reducing, I think we need to take more risks on who we target. The other point I'll make, and I won't bother to explain this diagram, although I'm deeply in love with it.
You have 3 more minutes, yeah?
Yes, ma'am. So the other point I will make is that when we talk about integrating people into supply chain, we're talking about enhancing their entrepreneurial opportunities, we need to realize 2 things. One is it's risky, and 2, not everyone is going to succeed in business even when trying. And this is part of another thing that comes out of this impact evaluation, and that as you look across it, you find a strong heterogeneity of impacts. Some people fail. Now, and that's to be expected, so we need to sort of incorporate that into our thinking if what we actually think we're doing is poverty reduction. Now this takes me, I think, quite naturally to a point John Hoddenot stressed yesterday, and I just want to come back to a couple of other points. John's point was, and again it was just mentioned a moment ago, is that social protection can potentially be productive. In the sense that it can reduce costly income smoothing, that is, families that allocate their resources in very conservative, low-earning ways because they're worried about risk. I like to call that positive moral hazard. So if you provide a type of social insurance, it crowds in greater entrepreneurial risk-taking, and we think of that as a very, very good thing. So that's an incredibly powerful hypothesis, right? It suggests that if you can provide forms of social protection, then indeed we might anticipate a multiplicative, a kind of a response. So maybe we can achieve that with simple cash transfers, which are non-cyclical, right? They're always there, it doesn't matter what's going on. Or maybe we can achieve it with explicit insurance mechanisms, such as index insurance contracts, which are actually explicitly counter-cyclical. When things are worse, then you get insurance payments. But again, the big question is, can that really work? Is that, for years, economists like me and many of us in this room have been looking at risk as a force which inhibits the productivity of the small farm sector. So the question then becomes, can social insurance and social protection mechanisms actually unleash some of that potential that is there? Cash transfers, I won't say too much about. Again, time is not really going to permit this to say. This is just evidence from South Africa. I just want to mention one number that says when you have cash transfers, yes, you can have nutritional impacts. These, by the way, are unconditional transfers. If you look at the benefit-cost ratio of these cash transfers, it's about 150%. Okay, very high rate of return if you value the future labor earnings of the better-nourished children. It's a remarkable number. This is a study, this is results also from South Africa looking at an asset transfer program. Again, let me not go into detail, but again, I think methodologically sound impact evaluation. And the benefit cost ratio on this program absolutely swamps the rate of return on the cash transfer. Okay, and I think that's because in this particular instance, when families in South Africa, landless, have been given assets, that brings a multiplicative effect that again increases their income. So I think a challenge to a lot of us as we start thinking how far down that income distribution can one move? Can you actually directly involve people in an agricultural growth process? Part of our thinking there has to be not only cash transfers, but maybe in some instances also asset transfers. And I think those of us that do research, and that's certainly IFPRI, I think we need to get work on asset transfers into the same metric that has made the work on cash transfers so impactful. And I'm just trying to tease you with this work on South Africa because it's kind of saying maybe the rates of return socially are much, much higher on an asset transfer and a cash transfer. That doesn't mean it'll work everywhere and for everyone, but it's something to think about. The final point is just mind the gap. And let me just summarize it this way. Margaret Thatcher said quite famously at one point in time, TINA, there is no alternative, meaning there is no alternative to economic liberalization. Well, that's actually not a very healthy situation, I don't think. Okay, so I've been doing some work lately on the political economy of Latin American economies. And when there is no alternative, that is, if we are sitting in economies where there's some polarizing tendency, then we can predict that as people learn about that, we can predict that there's going to be shift away from certain kinds of policies. And if there is no real coherent alternative out there on the table, that's actually, I don't think, good for any of us. So interestingly enough, in the United States during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, many people talked about defunding the left. And I think in a sense, maybe there's something to be thought about refunding the left. And by that I mean, let's think hard about sort of progressive social programs that make sense. Now that sounds incredibly wacky, but I know there's several of us here who are in the midst of competing for money from the Gates Foundation that's exactly in the middle of trying to create a new generation of think tanks in Latin America. And I think that's actually incredibly important that we all, and this isn't really a left or right issue, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. I think it's really important for all of us as we look at the reality of the growth processes, as we take John Williamson seriously and saying something isn't working quite right, then we need to put our thinking caps on and we need to make sure there is some kind of alternative, not that there is no alternatives. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.